Hello, welcome to this week's lecture. If you already read the documents I assigned for this week, you might wonder where we suddenly ended up. What is this place? We skipped ahead from 1800, almost 30 years. We're now in the mid-1820s. And suddenly we don't recognize the country anymore. It is not the small, tight-knit commercial towns of the eastern seaboard, but it looks like Manchester or Liverpool, one of those English cities where you have large industrial proletariat. In other words, a group of people who are impoverished, not because they are unemployed, but because they work. And they work for wages that don't meet that old standard out of the moral economy anymore, that by your day's work, you're supposed to gain a livelihood. And the tattering of the social fabric that results from that people had seen in England is now also evident in the United States. Here, all of a sudden, you now have mothers in the working class who are trying to hold on to their apartments and feed their children without the support of a husband. You have people who are succumbing to alcoholism, who are children who are hanging out at places that are not appropriate for them, like the theater, which is not a censored and sort of whitewashed family entertainment kind of venue by any means in the 1820s and 30s. Orphans who are passed around between one family member and another, often taken advantage of in various horrible ways by the adults that they encounter and that's supposed to take care of them. Children who feel that the safest place for them to be in the city of New York is by joining a gang and hiding out in a lumberyard. So this is not an America that people would recognize from the generation of the founders. And for the working class in particular, the people who took up arms to fight for the freedom of their country, once in this revolution in 1776, and again in the often forgotten War of 1812, well, where actually most of the fighting happened in 1814, but nevertheless, where you had another war with Britain, where the British actually went and burned down the White House in Washington, D.C., and made a bid for taking Baltimore, memorized, of course, in the Star Spangled Banner, a song you might have heard. So what happened here? How did the country turn out this way? The short answer, and the one most important answer, is capitalism happened. When we talked about Alexander Hamilton and his fiscal policy, we talked about one condition for the possibility of the emergence of capitalism, which was the creation of a financial system that would allow people to borrow large amounts of money and to pool large amounts of money to go into large-scale industrial development, to take the old manufacturing system that was based on households, small households with masters, apprentices, and journeymen, to kick the journeymen and apprentices to the curb and tell them, if you want to come back here, find a house, find an apartment of your own. You're no longer automatically taken care of. You're going to come back working for wages. The freedom, of course, tremendous. You can now pick where you want to work. You can pick where you want to live. You no longer have to eat at the same table as your master. Chances are you're probably not going to be eating at all, nor at a table, because the wages don't pay your way. So how does this come to pass? Is this a matter of the rich taking advantage of the poor? Is this a matter of a somehow, is there wrongdoing involved? Are people doing stuff that is illegal or unethical? To explore that, and to give away the answer, no, not exactly. In fact, everything that happens here is legal and ethical under the conditions of that new economic and legal system that was put in place when the revolution took down the old order that was established by the king and all the laws that go with it. So And for most people who participate, it's hard to pinpoint where exactly they are getting taken advantage of, to avoid the perhaps objectionable phrase, where they're getting screwed over. So everything that happens here seems kosher, and yet the outcome is the devastation of the working class and a radical transformation of American society for the worse, except for a handful of people, definitely for the worse. My approach to understanding what's happening here and to explaining it is to go to the two great theorists of capitalism. One is Adam Smith, who establishes the basic terminology. The other is Karl Marx, who works based on the insights of Adam Smith and, as it were, thinks them through, takes the system developed by Smith and thinks it through to its logical consequence. Where Smith assumed that capitalism was a sustainable system that would work out for the best for everybody, Marx, using only Smith's assumptions, comes to the conclusion that, in fact, it isn't. If it works as designed, it doesn't work. It is inherently crisis-prone, and it will not deliver the results it promises, which is, according to Smith, to get the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In fact, it doesn't distribute the greater goods that it can produce to the greatest number of people, but to a much smaller number of people than the previous system. So inequality rises. And the living standard of the people at the bottom, say 60 to 80% of the population, that's the bottom, deteriorates if you measure that by the average wealth per person that is created. So yes, working class people now also have access to indoor plumbing on occasion, and other trappings of modern industrial society. But that doesn't mean that they're richer than the people had been a generation before, not if measured by any sensible standard, which has to be the overall wealth of the society. So I want to use this lecture to really develop the argument from the ground up with the basic concepts that if you've read Adam Smith and you haven't read Karl Marx, these concepts will not be alien. And I'm going to switch to sharing my lecture with you here. Here it is. So the definitions, the terms that we're going to be talking about will be capital, labor, commodity, exchange, value, money, profit, and exploitation. And I strongly recommend that you don't try to find definitions for these by Googling them, because I'm discussing them here in the context of a system of thought, where if you pry them apart from that, you might get contradictory results. So there are a couple of definitions to take care of if we're talking about capital, and I want to do that in order. First, the definition of capital. Capital is money that you spend in order to make more money. Therefore, to become a capitalist, which is to say an owner of money, you have to have money to spare. You have to have money that you don't need to spend to make a living, to feed yourself, to house and clothe yourself, but that you can use for another purpose, for instance, to make more money with it. Capitalism is a system where the owners of money control social production. So not every society where they are capitalists is a capitalist society. Just because you have a merchant that has money to spare and spends that money to make more money, that doesn't mean you're living in a capitalist society. Capitalism is rather where, by and large, residual categories excluded, social production, that is to say, the means of production, factories, infrastructure, and land, and everything else, like the communications infrastructure and so forth, is controlled and owned as capital, as an investment by owners of money. who invest their money to make more money with it. So whereas before in the moral economy, if you had asked people, what is the purpose of an economy, of economic activity, they would have told you, well, of course, to feed people and to meet their needs. In capitalism, the obvious assumption is the purpose of an economy is to make money. It's to make people rich. And if that means to not feed people, to impoverish them, that seems to be an acceptable side effect. Capitalist commodity production is when you produce goods with the intent of selling them for a profit. So you're approaching production not like the craftsman of old, who says, I have a God-given skill that I developed as my calling. It is part of me doing my part for furthering the greater good and the glory of God, to be the best carpenter, to take that seriously and to take pride in the fact that the stuff I produce feeds me and my family, as well as is useful to the people who buy that stuff. So this is a totally different approach to why you produce stuff. It is about the stuff you produce, and it's about the good it does. Capitalist commodity production is flipped. Once again, you make stuff because you know you're going to be making money that way. And of course, you all know the stories of production being shifted overseas and factories being sold and so forth, because the owners are not interested in what they're making. They're interested in how much money or whether it is making them any money at all. But usually it is making them money, but it's not making them enough to be satisfied. So for that reason, you might still produce the same goods, but the way they appear on the market is completely different. Now, a second meaning of capital is the aggregate number of capitalists in a society. And here, when we're talking about capital versus labor, capital is the class of people who own money and control production, the capitalists. The distinction between the capitalist and capital as a class is important, because we'll see later that what somebody wants as a capitalist, as an owner of money who wants to make more money, may well differ from what he wants as a capitalist, as somebody who is a member of a social class that has interests that have to go beyond making money, so that in the future they can continue to make money individually. Collectively, they need to want things that cost money, so that in the future individually they can keep making money. Now, on the opposite of this duality, you have labor. And here again, a couple of definitions matter. First, labor as such is any human activity that produces goods or services that satisfy someone's needs or wishes. So whatever you make with your own handiwork, and in fact, not just handiwork, but mental exertion as well. If you think of something, if you develop something, that too counts as labor, the production of stuff that satisfies someone's needs or wishes. Now, notice that the wishes here includes possibly things that are imaginary, that satisfy not physical needs, but intellectual, mental needs. For instance, if you write a book that edifies people, this is certainly also a form of labor that requires a specific kind of training, of course, as all labor does. But you do that because you're skilled and you enjoy doing it, hopefully, and it's what you're trained to do. Now, free labor, and here is a potential stumbling block for you. Free labor doesn't mean that the person who works is working for free. It actually means the exact opposite. When we're talking about free labor, we're talking about labor performed by people who are legally free. And that means that you can't just force them to work. You can't just have them work for free, but rather what you're doing here is that you're paying them because they're free people. And in order to get them to work for you, you have to pay them money and enter into a contract with them. And wage labor is really the same thing. If you don't own money, in a society that is capitalist, you can't use the path to making money that is involved in becoming a capitalist, which is to say you take your money, you invest it, and you make more money that way. If you don't have any money to begin with, you can't do that. So how are you going to make money? How are you going to meet your needs? Because obviously everything you want costs money, to quote the Smiths. The only other way, of course, is to work for others for money, to use the skills that you have to work for somebody else, to sell your labor, to sell the entire capacity for productive activity that you have by virtue of your intelligence, strength, skills, training, and so forth. Now, a second definition of labor is the social category opposed to capital. Labor as the class of people who are legally free, but who are in practice, in everyday life, not free because they are dependent on capital for their survival. They are absolutely compelled to either starve and become homeless or to sell their ability to work to somebody else, namely somebody who belongs to the opposite social class of capital. And if you don't get to do that, you're out. There is really not much. I mean, you can say, I'm going to move to the land and farm, but have you ever actually considered the amount of capital required to set up a farm? Possibly, if you're from the Central Valley, you might have, but many people who bring this up as an example, well, why don't you just move to the land and live off the land, have probably not really thought about the economics of agriculture. Now, the missing link between capital and labor is the commodity. Production in a capitalist society is, as I said, commodity production. And a commodity is something that you make not because of its usefulness, not with the thought towards its usefulness, but because you know you're going to be making money by making it. And of course, in capitalist commodity production, you're not actually making something to sell it. You're having somebody else make it for you so that you can sell it. So that's the whole point. But what is the definition now of a commodity? Anything that is for sale in the market, whether or not it was produced right then and there. Really, the only thing that counts, that makes a thing, a good, into a commodity, is that it finds a seller, a buyer in the market. You can produce cars all day long, and you can offer them for sale, but they don't really prove themselves as commodities unless they are sold. Consider the housing crisis of 2008. People had built large tracts of new houses that were meant as commodities for sale in the market. And it turned out they didn't meet the basic standard because they weren't sold. They stood there empty and started rotting. In order to become a commodity, something needs to satisfy a human want or need. So once again, this is not just about physical needs. It can also be about spiritual, intellectual, and whatever other imaginary or mental needs. Another thing that commodities have in common is that they are products of labor. Nothing other than air, and not even really water, because water is there. But as you know, living in California, that doesn't mean much, because you also have to put in large amount of work to build the infrastructure to get it from there to here. So even the water in this particular place is a product of labor. Somebody must not only have a use for it in the abstract, but they need to have one of those right now. So for instance, yes, you want to sell a car, but you're not going to sell it to somebody who already has a car. That person must also want a car and must be in need of one. And then he needs to be willing and able to buy it. Another condition is, of course, the owner of the commodity must not need it. If he's still using it, he's not going to sell it, unless, of course, he desperately needs the money for something else. But the normal case here is I'm going to sell my old car to you because I bought a new one. Or I'm going to sell a car to you because I am the automobile manufacturer and that is what I do. I'm not making all these cars to use them myself. I'm not Henry Ford and I need 1 million cars. I know full well that the point of making them is to give them to somebody else for money. So, and finally, what is also required is the free market, that the buyer and the seller are free to make up their own minds as to whether they want to buy and sell and how much they want to pay. And if they can't meet on all these grounds, then the sale does not take place. So, in other words, the availability, the existence, and the exchange of a commodity in the market, the availability of a market, the freedom of the participants in the market, the existence of a market are part of the definition of a commodity. No free market, therefore no commodity. And that means that we also need to look at the next term, exchange, because in a market, things are exchanged. You can either exchange them for other things, or you can exchange them for money. Like I said, in the medieval and early modern city, you certainly had a market, but you didn't really have a free market. People were exchanging things for money, but they didn't do that as free agents, and they didn't do that under the conditions where they could enter into their own contracts for buying and selling. The guilds set the prices, sometimes the law set the prices, and so forth. You can have barter, that is to say, people don't use money, and this would be true, for instance, if you remember, in Western Pennsylvania, at the time of the Whiskey Rebellion. It is certainly a free market, but it's not one that involves money. Instead, people use whiskey for the purpose of money, or in many cases, they simply barter. So if you're making turnips and I'm making potatoes, we might meet to swap those, and we're going to do a best estimate as to what the value is in exchanging these things. But of course, that also requires that the parties to this exchange in a free market are not just free in terms of their agency to say, yes, I want to buy, yes, I want to sell, but also free in having access to information, which is why freedom of the press, freedom of speech is so important for a capitalist society to function. So that both sides can figure out, is that amount really adequate? Is it fair? Or is somebody trying to take advantage of it? And so on that basis, the agreement between the two parties is valid. If one party knows something the other party doesn't know, then that's problematic. And finally, once you get a fully developed capitalist marketplace, all money and all commodities are universally interchangeable. Anything can be sold anywhere. Anything can be bought anywhere. And so the internet in its current shape and stage is really just the coming into its own of the concept of the capitalist free market. Literally, you can go on the web and you can buy anything, any place. Some of it happens on the dark web and is illicit or illegal. But even if you don't want to go there, seriously, I can't think of anything that you couldn't find with a little bit of patience and buy it. So what happens in this moment of exchange that links the commodity, that makes the commodity a real thing? Because after all, unless it is exchanged, it wasn't a commodity to begin with. The universal interchangeability of everything, the fact that you can convert anything into money on the market, implies that these equations here are valid. If in a barter system, two farmers meet, one has a gallon of milk and the other has a dozen eggs, and they agree to exchange these things. I'm going to give you the eggs in exchange for the milk. Then this is an equivalent exchange in practice. The equal sign indicates that what's happening here is two things are exchanged as equal. So you can dissolve that into saying the gallon of milk is a commodity and the dozen eggs is a commodity, which is kind of redundant. Commodity equals commodity, right? But you can also bring it to the common denominator in terms of money. The gallon of milk equals, for instance, $1. So therefore, the dozen eggs also equals $1 because we're exchanging one for the other at the assumption that they're worth the same. Or conceptually speaking, you can say the eggs are a commodity, but the dollar amount that you're interchanging them with is money. So therefore, a commodity equals money. Money and commodity can be interchanged, are interchangeable. Certainly at a certain quantity, but the essence is in it. So what is the common denominator? If you say that $1 worth of milk is worth $1 worth of eggs. Certainly you can pull out the dollar amount and say $1 is worth $1. That's redundant. But what you're also saying is that milk equals eggs. They are interchangeable, therefore they must be the same thing. This is where we're entering into absurd territory, because while they're both foodstuff, nonetheless, clearly milk is not eggs. They both come from different animals. Even if you weren't born on the farm, you probably have an idea of that. So what is that thing that makes milk and eggs equal? Adam Smith found that the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities whenever they are exchanged is their value, because nobody would argue that milk is the same as eggs. If you want to make a pancake and you can't substitute the eggs with milk, so therefore eggs is not the same as milk. But if you're going into the marketplace and you complete that exchange, a dozen eggs against a gallon of milk, then yes, eggs is the same as milk. So that the thing that is the same, that makes these things interchangeable, is their value. But that value applies to these things only in the act of exchange. So if you looked into the pancake batter and you tried to find the value of the milk and the eggs, you would come up empty. And the reason for that is that obviously value is not a physical substance. It is a social relation. And the truth of the equation that milk equals eggs is therefore obviously not, or not so obviously, it is not about the physical properties of the things. It is not something that is physically inherent in them, but they become comparable only because they march to market in the company of a buyer and seller. It is the relationship between the buyer and the seller that through them transforms the milk and the eggs into something different that is independent of their physical properties. It transforms them into commodities. So the value that they have in common in this exchange is therefore the product of a social relation between seller and buyer. So what is this value that is the common substance of these things that we interchange? For the people in a barter economy who make that stuff themselves, that they bring to market, the cost to them of bringing that stuff to market is clear. It took them time to make it. You had to feed the chickens, you had to build a coop for them, you had to milk the cow, you had to feed the cow, you had to secure the pasture with fencing against predators. So you know that you had to put in a certain amount of labor so that in the end you get a certain quantity of milk. And therefore each gallon that you either drink yourself or that you bring to market has a value to you that you can measure in labor time that went into it. And even on a more basic level, therefore, what you can say is that the things that come to market can be compared because they are the products of labor. That is how you arrive at a point where you can actually find what they're worth in relation to each other, because the other person, who produces the eggs, can also do the same calculation in his mind. And you know how much it takes to produce things if you are both living in an agricultural economy and you're simply, part of it. In a more complex economic system, this is still true. Ultimately, it comes down to the amount of labor time needed to produce a thing. However, in a more developed division of labor, you no longer look at how long it took the individual to make that particular thing, but rather to buy any specific item, the consideration is how long should it take on average, given the skills, the technology, and so forth that is available in a society to make one of those. And for that reason, you can have such a thing as a blue book, to return to the example of cars, where you know exactly just how much any make and model and year is worth. And what is reflected in that from the point of view of the makers of the blue book is, of course, an average of what people actually paid, being well-educated and informed buyers and sellers. But what are they educated about? What is the basic assumption that goes into it? The thesis that Smith develops is that it's the labor time. It is to know that how much could you make this yourself in the same amount of time. That's the original for the producer. But even in a complex society with a high degree of division of labor, that consideration never goes away. It just kind of becomes forgotten. So it's the average time needed. In other words, if it takes me a long time to make something, if I'm going to dabble in carpentry and build a table, and it takes me 6 months to make a table that isn't very good, that a skilled carpenter could make for you in a week and it would be much better, that doesn't mean that I am going to be able to charge you that much more for the table I made because it took me 6 months. The buyer will sell, well, no, it shouldn't have taken you that long. You're not a skilled carpenter. In fact, it doesn't look like you know what you're doing at all. So I'm not buying that table for any amount of money. It's the average time needed to produce a thing that is showing that it's been produced with the level of competence available commonly in that society. So now we know that if two people meet in the marketplace, they assume that the things they have value. And if the value of the things they have is equal, they will interchange them, they will exchange them. We now also know that the measure of the value is the labor time, how long it takes to make them. But we also know that these commodities can all be exchanged for money instead of for other things. So this is a convenience where all value can be expressed in money, meaning that if you come to market to sell a gallon of milk and there is nobody in the marketplace offering anything that you need to barter, you will take money in exchange. And the money, again, we discussed this when we talked about the whiskey, the money has to meet the standard that it will still be good at a later date. It won't lose any of the value. It remains a reliable repository of value. And therefore, you can stretch your transaction of buying and selling through time and place. You can either wait until next week to take the money back to market. If you had waited a week with that gallon of milk, it would have gone sour in the meantime. Or you can move to another marketplace, walk over another town, see if somebody is selling something there that you might need. So time and space becomes stretched through the introduction of money. Value becomes more long-lasting. So now we've completed our first 3 steps of transformation. We know that labor creates value. Labor makes things that have value because people take them to market to buy and sell them, and there they compare their value. This value can be expressed as money. That is the reason why there is money. It is a repository for value. Normally, in the example of the seller of a gallon of milk, that money is just waiting to be turned back into another commodity, to be dissolved again into value by buying something that is going to get consumed. But what if this farmer now doesn't need the money at all for his own livelihood? What if he can sell milk because he has enough for himself that he makes? He doesn't actually need to buy anything at all. So over time, he's going to accumulate a lot of money, and he's going to think about ways to make something with that money. He's going to invest it, and that is how money then becomes capital. Money that I don't need, that I'm going to use to make more money with it. What is implied in this transformation, in this chain of transformation? The main implication is that labor is the source of capital. In fact, labor is the essence, is the defining substance of capital. Or, to put it another way, capital is alienated labor. Alienated as in it belonged to somebody else who did the labor, and it becomes capital in somebody else's hand, distinct from the original owner of the labor. So, the next step then, when we're no longer talking about individuals who go to market with the stuff they made their own selves, we are talking about capitalism and commodity production. People who don't make stuff and sell it because they have something to spare. Their cows produce more milk than they could possibly drink. But rather now we're talking about people who own a large agricultural estate where they hire farm labor to milk the cows for them and sell it for profit. And they know that ahead of time they're going to be selling this stuff for profit. So it's a capitalist commodity. So for the person who is not an owner of capital, is not an owner of money, and who tries to make a living and is going to find work to get a job, to get paid, to give his labor to somebody else, he's going to get paid a wage that comes from the capital of the person who hires him. He's going to, the capital that the person who hires him is made into a wage and then serves me as value so that I can buy things for my own needs, has its origins in labor. So it's the labor of a past generation that comes back to command the labor of the present generation. It's kind of like, you can liken it to zombies. You get the undead essence, the brain and muscle of the past, comes back to eat the living. But this act whereby the owner of money buys the time of a person who doesn't have any money is another important leap in the system, because something else happens at this point that we haven't really considered so far. And now we're sort of leaving the safe grounds of Adam Smith, because this is part of what he didn't really think through to the logical consequence. But he did realize that labor becomes a commodity. It has to, because if you're a capitalist, you're not going to be making all that stuff yourself that you're going to sell in the market. You're going to hire people to make it for you. How are you going to hire people, though, if everybody in a society is living in a household as a dependent of a master? You can't do that. So implied in the simple step, you're going to hire people and pay them wages to work for you, is a radical social transformation, where somehow the people who used to live comfortably in these households have to be kicked out. And that is, of course, exactly what happens. In the United States, it happens after 1815, and within 10 years, this has gone a long, long way to the point where people wash up in cities as impoverished, miserable members of an underclass, of a proletariat. So whether it's in the countryside, people who used to live on the farm as laborers or family members and were part of the family business, whether it is the journeymen and apprentices in the cities, the laboring masses are cut loose and told, you can reapply for your job if we have work for you, and then we'll pay you a wage that will no longer meet your needs, but what else are you going to do? So for the meeting of the capitalist and the laborer in the marketplace, there is now another act of sale. I am selling you my time and my capacity to make stuff with my skill during that time, and you're going to pay me a wage. how do you know how much you get to pay me or how much I have to ask? And here we return to the original definition of the commodity. If the measure of the value of any commodity is the amount of labor time that went into making this commodity, then if labor becomes a commodity too, we need to ask, what is the value of labor? In other words, what is the amount of time needed to produce labor? But labor doesn't come detached from the human being that performs it. So how do you produce labor? What part of that human being is the labor that needs to be paid off if you hire that person for wages? You really can't separate the labor from the human being. Automation or not, machines or not. Ultimately, even the automatons, the algorithms, have been devised by people. The machines have to be built by people, and they have to be tended to and repaired when they break down by people. So you can't get the human out of the equation, no matter how much capital would like to do that. But of course, in this first phase of industrialization, it's a whole lot more labor intensive. So that question is not yet on the table. So if you need to hire somebody to perform work for you, you have to hire somebody who is not just skilled and yet available, that is to say, desperate to be paid money so that he can feed himself and his family. But you also have to consider that he is in good enough shape to come back day after day to do the work at the level of skill, alertness, dexterity, and so forth that you require. So you have to make sure that the person can eat, drink, be housed, and so forth, so that the labor power remains intact, remains at the same level day in, day out. Capital is not a living thing, even though it is the representation and a product of the labor of living people, but it doesn't age, it doesn't get old, it doesn't die. People, on the other hand, do that. And so if capital wants to keep reproducing itself, if it wants to keep making more money out of even more money, it has to hire more people and more highly skilled people generation after generation. Therefore, raising and educating children on the part of the working class is not something that is external to the considerations of capital. It is essential to it, because capital needs to find the same working class in place a generation from now, ideally a larger and better skilled and healthier working class than today. So if you're really paying somebody at value, all of these things are part of the labor time necessarily required to put that person in that place today where he can work for you. You have to consider the lifetime of that person and the cost that is essential for putting that person in this place and eventually producing a replacement. So let's just assume now that we have an example here where somebody is paid at value. At value, that would mean that over the lifetime of a person, you consider college tuition, retirement, healthcare, raising the children, any things you need for their clothing, feeding, school, their health, taking care of your elderly parents, any emergencies, the occasional vacation, rest time. So you can calculate a lifetime amount that a person needs to be able to make in wages to pay for all that, and then he's paid at value. You can divide that through the number of years somebody will spend in the labor force. Let's call it 50 years for the sake of argument. So you divide that lifetime sum by 50, then you know what somebody has to be making per year, and you can divide it into months and so forth. So you know exactly how much you need to pay a person. And let's now assume that this is how things go in our textile industry, because textile is the first major industry. Somebody like Moses Spear, out of the contract that the group will be discussing, who is a textile manufacturer, he is hiring people, he's buying looms, these machines that make yarn into cloth. He is building a factory, he is providing the yarn, and now he's paying weavers to make cloth from the yarn on these power looms. And he's going to pay people at value. He's a reasonable employer. He only works people 10 hours a day rather than the customary 12 at the time. And what is in it for him? Well, the cloth that comes out of the production process at the end of the day, that'll belong to him and he can sell that. He is buying labor because it has that specific use to him, that it produces value. The value of the cloth exists because the labor went into making yarn into cloth. No labor, no cloth. So, and you get paid for the cloth because of the value. And now you can take that to market. Now, assume that the worker who comes to work needs $80 a day to meet his needs. And he is getting paid for his 10-hour workday, $8 per hour. He is getting paid a living wage. He is paid at value. This is enough to send the kids to college or possibly, apprentice them as weavers. During these 10 hours per hour, you make 10 yards of cloth, 100 yards in your 10-hour shift. And in the marketplace, your employer will sell that cloth for $1 a yard. That comes to $100. So what's left is $20, right? If you had your own power loom and you had some money to spare on the yarn, you would be a capitalist or you would be a small-time weaver, but you would own what you made. And so the $100 from selling the cloth, that would be yours. In this case, however, you go home with $80 because that is the value of your labor and that is what you get paid for. After all, you're not a cloth maker, you're a worker. So you get paid the value of your labor, that's $80. It just so happens that the product you make, the value of that product is $100. The value created by the labor is more than the value of the labor. And if that wasn't the case, then there would never have been any progress at all. This is something that is inherent in human labor. It so happens that in our daily lives, we can produce things that are of greater value than the value of the things we must consume during the same time period to sustain ourselves. That is really the secret of success, of the thriving of the human race, that we can produce greater value than we need to consume. But now this person in our example works for a capitalist who owns everything else. So the difference between the value of my labor and the value of the product of my labor, the $20, get pocketed. This is what we call surplus value. The wage, here, $100, that's the value of the product of my labor, the cloth I made. In blue, the wage, that is the value of my labor, but the cost to put me there and put me in place as a producer of things. The difference is $20, and that is the surplus value. This is an important definition to keep in mind. Surplus value equals the difference between the value of my product and the value of my labor, the red and the blue. But of course, the surplus value is not yet the profit. There's other things to be taken care of. And of course, you need to make a profit if you are going to be a capitalist, or else, you'd be failing at that. You have other expenses, the depreciation of the machinery, the cost of marketing, insurance, so many things. So only after that, if you've taken care of the non-wage expenses, can you talk of profit. But one thing is for sure, the only way that you will make profit is it's going to come out of the surplus value. The difference between the product, the value of the product, and the value of the labor that made it. Everything that is not wage is difficult to influence. leading many employers to feel that they are really victims here because they don't have that much market power. They're always trying to get more market power to influence prices and conditions because they really don't have much individual influence over changing that. But the softest spot in the equation is the wage. So if you can somehow tinker with that, if you could pay the worker under his value, you would be making that much more money. So if you are interested in maximizing your profit, you need to increase the surplus value. How do you do that? You can, for instance, tell the person who comes to work for you to work 2 hours more. You're still going to pay him $80, which is fair because, after all, the value of labor is the amount of money needed for its reproduction. And we established $80 a day pays for the whole thing. Comfortable life, education of the children. So you're good. But you're telling the worker to stay for another 2 hours, so he's making $120 worth of cloth for you, whereas before he made $100 worth. And suddenly the surplus value jumps, it doubles from $20 here to $40 there. This is all yours. So if you were taking $18 out of this chunk here as unrelated expenses, and you made a profit of $2 out of 100, which is $2 out of these 20, these additional $20 here on the top are all yours. So your profit is going to be $22. You pay $18 in this example for non-wage expenses. You get another $20 here that you don't need for that. So you have $22. It's an 11-fold increase in your profit for a mere 2 hours of additional work. I mean, who's going to say no to that? You can decrease the wage, although note that at this point, you're no longer paying the person at value. He may yet be able to come back the next day, having eaten and slept. He might have to take a second job. He will not be able to send the kids to school. He's not going to put money on the side for retirement. And over time, his own health and well-being and that of his family and his descendants is going to deteriorate. So you're kind of cutting your own flesh here because, what's the English expression? You're shooting yourself in your own foot as an employer, because the next person that comes to work for you in the next generation is going to be less skilled, less strong, less healthy. Unless, of course, you can draw on immigration, where you take people from other countries that don't work that way, that train their people, and that will come here because they find that this is worth their while. Oftentimes, that is how it works. So, but if you get away with that, if you can cut the wage in half, if there is lots of unemployment and competition in the labor market, you might be able to get away with that. You're still having the person work for $100 worth of cloth, and lo and behold, your share of the loot goes from $20 to $60. Technically, actually, still surplus value remains this chunk here. The value of the labor remains 80. You're just no longer paying the person at value. You're paying him at half his value. Let's assume we don't want to be that mean. We want to do right by the person working for us. So we'll keep paying him $80, which is the amount he needs to gain a decent livelihood. We're paying at value. But we're not satisfied with him producing $100 worth of stuff in his 10-hour day. So we're going to train him better. We're going to get better machinery. We're going to improve the lighting in the factory. We'll give him a break at the halfway point. We'll allow him to eat on our expense in the cafeteria. So he's going to be more highly motivated, better skilled. He's working with better equipment. So his productivity suddenly increases. And in his 10-hour day, he now produces $160 worth of things. That's great, because now all else being equal, The worker is highly satisfied, is getting paid what he needs, but the surplus value, now in reality, because the value of the product of labor increases from 100 to 160, the surplus value actually now amounts to $80, same as the value of labor. So this is a dream, because if we have $18 of expenses on this amount here, perhaps that will increase a little bit because now we're spending more money on training, machinery, and whatnot. But you're still going to see a much bigger chunk of surplus value, hence much more profit. Or if you want to, and if you went to business school and studied your, neoclassical economics, you might just want to do all these things at once. Have the person work longer, pay him half the amount, and put in better machinery and require him to get better training, but on his own dime. So at that point, you're really going to be raking it in. But we're not assuming that, and we don't have to assume that. We're going to assume that the person who is working gets paid at value. It would be very easy to get away with not paying him at value, but let's not assume that's happening. So the person is paid at value. What happens to the wages? What happens to that? He uses those wages to meet his needs. If not in the present, then in the future. Because if you're saving for illness, retirement, the college fund for the kids, that is also money that's spoken for. It will get spent eventually. So it doesn't build your wealth. It means that you're going to live a better life and that you're going to improve the education of the next generation. But it doesn't become capital. It becomes money. It remains money. It is spent to meet a person's needs. The profit, on the other hand, becomes the basis for more wealth, and it will turn back into capital in the future. Why? Because remember, if you're going to have money that you turn into capital, it is going to be money that you don't need for your individual consumption. So the profit, therefore, comes back to you as even more money that you don't need. So what are you going to do with that except invest it? And if you keep doing that, maybe you will spend money for the occasional villa or yacht or private plane, but nonetheless, there isn't enough stuff around to buy. Eventually, you will get more money out of this. So the share of the wealth of a society that is owned by the wealthiest people is going to go up and up and up. Whereas the best that the people who work for wages can hope for is that they're going to meet their needs and be able to put something on the side for future reference. Is this fair? Yes. There is nothing fraudulent in the examples we used, except where you cut the wage in half and don't pay at value. But if the worker is paid at value, we also assume that the customer pays for the product at value, because in a free marketplace where universally information is available, people don't overpay. You can't overcharge. Commodities are exchanged at value. So the transactional justice, the fairness of this whole thing is evident to anybody who looks at it, which makes it so hard to understand how, nonetheless, the result is inequity or unfairness. So this is where we come to a term that is now purely Marx. It is no longer based on Adam Smith, but this is where Marx reaches the logical conclusions that he says Smith sidesteps or avoids. If you look at the picture from the point of view of this weaver, he has needs to meet, and he doesn't want to be a freeloader. He wants to work for his keep. And what he needs to take from the wealth of society is $80 a day to live nicely. And he can do that because in 8 hours, he can produce stuff that is worth $80. At this point, he would have done his due. He would be even with society. But because he can't do that on his own, he has to work for somebody who is in the market just for profit. So he's going to work 2 hours beyond these 8 hours he would need to work to put back into the big pot of society what he took out of it. And these 2 hours of extra work are another way of looking at surplus value. That's the time when he makes the $20 of surplus value. And that is what Marx defines as exploitation. So not as an individual act of unfairness to the person who's doing the work, but on a social scale, the private appropriation of that surplus value. The owners of money who become capitalists, who control and organize the entire production process, are entitled by law to pocketing that difference, to taking the surplus value. But Marx argues this surplus value belongs to society. It is literally the product of social labor. In any other historical epoch, there was an acknowledgement and realization of that. Whether you're saying, this is for the glory of God or this is for the king, there was not the notion that this is simply something that a group of random people could pocket and do with as they please, without consideration to the social utility, morality, or whatever else. So if you're assuming, therefore, that the system is working as designed, that capitalism is working as designed, it is going to increase inequality over time. And while these 2 charts here may not be exactly perfectly comparable, nonetheless, they hint at the basic fact here that 200 years of capitalism have not led to a more even distribution of wealth, but rather the contrary. It has led to a concentration of wealth at the top. One reason for that is that in the United States, you get overexploitation. That is, the capitalists are not satisfied with merely pocketing the surplus value. They're also paying people under value. This, for instance, is the business model of Walmart. The reason they can pay people under value is because they know that once they're done with their shift at Walmart, they can either go work another job or they can apply for government assistance. They know that programs like food stamps, like Medicare and so forth are available for people who need that, and therefore they don't have to pay people at value. You might be able to get away with that for a while as one individual business owner who is in pursuit of pure self-interest. But as you've seen, as a class, as capital as a social class can't do that sustainably. Because if they do that, then eventually their labor force is going to burn out and deteriorate. People will stop having children if they can't make sure that they get to have a decent life. They will get sick and die younger, and then they will be out of the labor force. Their sickness will cost money on a social scale that is going to be economically detrimental. So in other words, as a class, capital must want to pay a living wage. As the individuals that comprise that class, however, can't have an interest in that whatsoever. So how do you force the individual owner of money, the individual capitalist, to act in his class interest, to do what's right, not for some extraneous sense of justice, not because you're a do-gooder, not because you're interested in Christian charity, but really just for the one and only reason that you're not going to be a capitalist in the long term unless you also consider your class interest, your systemic interest in sustaining the system. Somehow, however, you can't do that as an individual because you see it's against your self-interest. So who is going to save capital from itself, from the split conscience? Who can make individual capitalists act with their systemic class interest in mind? It could be done by organizations of capitalists. In the German system, for instance, the Chamber of Commerce is not just a lobby group like it is here, but it's a membership organization where you have to belong to if you are an owner of a business, and it can impose sanctions on you. It comes with with legal rights, almost a little bit like the guilds of old. It makes laws that are binding for the people who belong to them. This doesn't work in the US. You don't have anything of that sort. The legal system is not built for that. But government can do the job. And in fact, government has been called the ideal common capitalist. The thesis being behind that term that in a capitalist society, only government can do the job of making capital act in its systemic interest against the will and wishes and self-interest of individual members of the capitalist class. And then, of course, historically, the workers with their demands saying, we want a living wage. Not that they were doing it for that purpose, but inadvertently, in asking to be paid living wages, they were in fact forcing capital to act in the systemic interest of capital at large. But in the United States, unions are also weak, and they have been weakened further in the past 40 years, ever since the Carter administration. It really accelerated under Reagan, and is continuing at a breathtaking pace right now, dismantling unions in any and all fields of the economy. So unions are not going to be playing that role. And government, the role of government in the economy is, as you know, highly fraught, where one political party argues that nothing government can do is ever a good thing, and that the best job, the most important job for government is to get out of the economy altogether. So, therefore, if you look at the social structure in this country, it is showing the signs of this ongoing and sustained unsustainable overexploitation. In 2007, the distribution of wealth in the United States was like this. The bottom 60% of the population had under 5% of the national wealth. The middle class, the next 30%, that is to say, between 60 and 90, had over 20%, still less than their share by population, and the top 10% had more than 70% of the wealth. And this is considering that down in this block here, the bottom 60%, the working class, people have houses and cars as their main assets. And then in the middle class, you also get 401ks, that is to say, stock ownership, a little bit of business ownership. So everything that's in this group here is really financial wealth. Stocks, bonds, hedge funds, what have you, capital, in other words, that is located in this chunk here, the top 10%, and their wealth. So if you compare in purple now, the number of people in each group, 60%, that's that many people have this much of a share. The middle class, like I said, is a little more equal, and the top 10% are clearly overrepresented here. Not because they are more deserving, not because they are smarter and more productive, rather because everybody else is working for them, and they have to because they are the owners of capital. Therefore, they get to determine who is employed, and the product of the labor belongs to them, and then they get to sell it in the market. If you ask yourself, where am I in this picture? Consider these boundaries here for annual household income in 2009 numbers. Add 10, maybe 10% to that for today. So if you're making less than 90,000 as the household income in your household per year, this is where you are. And if you're making between 90 and say 160,000, you're here. These are people, you know, like your teachers, like your college professors, opinion leaders, news anchors, journalists, who will tell you that, hey, after all, this system is good. It works pretty well. It works for us. What's wrong with it? These are people who are, of course, looking to the upper edge here of those who make more than 160,000 who would be in the top 10%. But within this top 10%, it's like Russian dolls nested one inside the other. If you look at the top 1%, most of what's here in this bar is going to be in the top 1%. Then, if you look at the top 1% and you bracket out of that the top 0.1%, you'll see that they have the biggest chunk of that again. So this picture of this curve, of this reverse sinus curve, is replicated within the top 10%. You can even go to the top 0.01% and you get the same picture. But because otherwise you might get dizzy, let's stick to these three groups and look at it from another angle. For the working class, for each dollar in the pocket of a person in the working class, a person in the middle class, that next 30% from the bottom or from the top, has $7, and a person in the top 10% has $72. So this is the result of the accumulation over time without checks and balances on overexploitation of capital accumulation and capitalist commodity production. And if you're looking at New York City in the 1820s and 1830s, where you have that picture of children living on the streets, their parents unable to feed them, barely able to feed themselves, this is the beginnings of it. The problem posed by this social question of mass impoverishment leads people to different approaches and answers, some more effective than others. There's moral reform movements that we'll discuss that approach it as a moral question. There is socialism and unions who approach it as a question of wealth and power. There are politicians like Andrew Jackson who approach it from a political angle and say this is a matter of government being manipulated and used by the rich for their benefit against the poor. And by any means, this debate is far from over. But this is my introduction to it, as we're going to be talking quite a bit about it over the next few weeks. So, any questions you have about this whole complex, you should definitely ask. I welcome any and all criticism. If you want to pick a fight with me over quoting Karl Marx, if you've read anything in the press about me, you know this was coming probably. I'm perfectly happy to indulge any criticism of that. In fact, you would make my day if you were going to tell me that Marx is a fraud and should not be read by anybody ever, because then we can talk about that and we can discuss it. So feel free to do that. But also, if you want clarifications of the concepts that I used, if you are interested in statistics or more facts about the industrialization of the country, we'll see how much of this the group can cover. But for the most part, the group should really focus on this contract that the House of Refuge enters into with the textile manufacturer Moses Spear, loaning a bunch of children who are inmates of this reform school to a textile manufacturer as workers, as cheap labor in a factory. So that kind of is a whole lot more texture to the life and times of the youth of the working class that you're reading about this week. So that's it for this week. And on this note, I will say goodbye and see you on another occasion.